Happy Monday. Hope you had a great weekend. We are back here on the Rocketeer Minute, a show where every day, Monday through Friday, we go over the greatest adventure movie Walt Disney's ever made, the 1991 Joe Johnston-directed movie, The Rocketeer. I'm one of your hosts, Jim O'Kane of TVDads.com.
And I'm Hal Bryan, an airplane nerd from the Experimental Aircraft Association right here in Oshkosh, Wisconsin.
And now already more than a quarter of an hour into this movie, we are finally getting away from the opening scenes of just Cliff and Peavy and the folks down at Chaplin Field. After destroying poor Lucky Lindy out there in the bean field, Cliff and Peavy are sneaking away in their pickup truck with, I'm not exactly sure what they're going to do with 7/8 of a Lucky Lindy statue that has a big divot taken out of his head.
Yeah, you think maybe they're just gonna sneak it back, put it in place, hope nobody notices, put a helmet on him.
Yeah, some kind of a Carmen Miranda headgear or something.
Because nobody would notice a giant basket of fruit on top of a statue of Charles Lindbergh. Oh. And Jim, I'm hoping right now that anybody listening under the age of 40 or so is busy Googling Carmen Miranda.
Carmen Miranda? Who was he talking about? Get yourself some bananas, look for the label Chiquita, and look at the lady behind the logo. So, anyway, this is not about bananas. This is about the Rocketeer. So we're out of the bean field, and we're getting to a scene of who, for all intents and purposes, so far, these seem to be the bad guys in the show. I mean, we've had Wilmer and Lenny seem to be the only bad guys we've seen so far, but these are apparently Wilmer and Lenny's middle management. So we're introduced to two characters, Eddie Valentine, and of course the movie star Neville Sinclair. But before we get to them, we have to look a little bit at the location that they're at. If you'll notice, they're in a rather cathedral-like Art Deco basilica. I'm not sure what to describe that set as, but it's not actually a set. It's a real life Hollywood house or a Los Feliz house. It's just below Griffith Park, known as the Ennis House, and technically it is what they call a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Although Frank Lloyd Wright made the original design for the building, his son Lloyd Wright kind of tried to finish the building, but it didn't really get set up the way that he wanted to. So it deviated a lot, and the owners finally said, "Look, thanks, but no thanks. We'll get you out of the way, and we'll finish up the design." And but still, it still has elements of the Frank Lloyd Wright design.
Well, it's amazing to think about tampering with the design of his. As a teenager, I read the book The Fountainhead, and the main character was an architect named Howard Rourke, who was not very transparently based on, or maybe very transparently. Which adverb do I want here, Jim? Anyway, it was very much based on Frank Lloyd Wright, and he was so particular about his designs. The stipulation, if you change anything of the design, the deal is off. And the climax of that book is when he blows up a housing project because somebody had the audacity to tamper with his original design. So it always makes me wonder, how particular was Frank Lloyd Wright about that in real life, and regardless, it still seems like architectural sacrilege, if there is such a thing.
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, I've been to a couple of Frank Lloyd Wright houses, and it is a beautiful design of his stuff. This particular house does follow that rule of hugging the brow of the hill, or as it's known in Welsh as Taliesin, which actually that's a very famous Wisconsin landmark. But that idea of just kind of merging with the landscape and not standing apart from it is evident in this particular house. Frank Lloyd Wright, he seemed to be a very determined guy. I used to live near a house in Virginia of his called the Pope Leahy House, and it was designed to, not only was it a Frank Lloyd Wright house, it was built as if Frank Lloyd Wright was going to live there. He was not a very tall man, so all of the lintels in the rooms and I know the carport, when you get out of your car, I'm over 6 foot, and it's really easy to bang your head if you're not, say, about 5'7", 5'8". So when I was there on one visit, a fellow that lived in the house when he was a kid was there and explaining what it was like living in a Frank Lloyd Wright house. And Frank Lloyd Wright didn't believe in storage spaces or closets. He thought of them as wastes of time. And a bedroom was just that. It was a room where your bed was and little else. So they didn't really have a lot of room for things like skis or Christmas trees and stuff. And what they did was they gave up one of the bedrooms and turned that into a storage area. And then whenever Frank Lloyd Wright was on tour and he wanted to stop by and inspect his creation, they'd rearrange all the furniture and take all the stuff out of their storage and put it out in a shed in the middle of the woods outside of Frank Lloyd Wright's view. So for a guy, I mean, he's the vendor and they're the customer, but the idea that the customers didn't want to upset him, maybe they were worried that he was going to blow the place up.
That could be. Maybe they read the Fountainhead.
Yeah.
It's funny you talk about the height and having to duck and things like that. Maybe the Lindbergh statue could fit in that carport.
There's a divot.
Now that he's been chopped a little bit. There's a Frank Lloyd Wright here house right here in Oshkosh, just about maybe 2 miles from where I am right now.
Wow.
I had to look up the name of it. It's called the Stephen B. Hunt Bungalow, and it's you could fairly easily drive by it and not notice, but when you do actually stop and take a look from the sidewalk, because I haven't yet mustered up the courage to go ring the bell and say, "Can I see your house, please? This is neat." But anyway, when you look at it, you see little elements of it, but it's a very modest little one-story sort of stucco place, but it's a neat little bit of history just down the road here.
Wow, yeah. They are interesting things to go, and yeah, that is the problem, that not all of them are museums. You expect to be able to just kind of wander up,
right?
And a lot of them are just like active buildings and stuff. I know, which is just kind of testament to how long those things last. They're still usable as buildings. Anyway, this is about the Rocketeer, not Frank Lloyd Wright, but it's just an interesting background in the set that we're staged here in, and we're meeting Eddie Valentine, who's we were going to find out later he's the owner of a nightclub called the South Seas, and he also seems to do some dirty work for famous Hollywood stars like, say, Neville Sinclair.
Right. And this first glimpse of Paul Sorvino, just as soon as you see him, you know exactly who he is.
Oh yeah.
There's absolutely no question. I mean, he might as well be wearing a sign that just says,
you remember me in Goodfellas?
Yeah, exactly. It says mob boss. And he's so amazing in Goodfellas. First time I watched Goodfellas, I walked out of there sort of scratching my head thinking, well, if I met Paulie, I could probably do a little crime here and there. It seems pretty reasonable. He seems like such a, you want him to be your uncle.
Yeah, I want to be in jail with him helping to cut the garlic and things like that.
Exactly.
Just make sure it's the right slice. But yeah, he seems like a great guy. Even except for the part that he seems to be a gangster, he seems like a great guy and probably is good to work for and would pal around with you.
Right. Until he murdered you, but before that, everything up to that point would be good.
It was a great ride, yeah.
Yeah, it was. Just before we started recording today, I was listening just to a couple minutes of Paul Sorvino singing, which is amazing. I didn't know until very recently that he's an opera singer.
Wow, I did not know that.
Incredible. And it's first you think, well, he's just he's sort of this mob boss. He's a mafia guy. He's you don't see him singing, but then you think, well, big kind of barrel-chested Italian baritone, and it's amazing. It's absolutely stunning. There's a few little YouTube clips that I found very quickly. So
I'm gonna have to look him up. That's amazing. I know he runs an acting school in Hollywood. Actually, I think it's in Westwood. But he's very actively teaching people how to do the craft of being an actor on stage. And everything I've ever seen him in, he's a very natural actor. He just seems to be, you believe the roles that he's in. He doesn't seem to be reading off lines. They seem to be coming into his head, and then he says them. It's just like it's not his turn to do his side of the script.
Right.
But a very enjoyable actor, and he does it really good right here. I mean, the first time we bump into him, he's already a bit ticked off, and he's trying to figure out what's happening to all of his henchmen. Lenny's dead. Wilm was wrapped up like a mummy at County General, and he's really mad at his client, Neville Sinclair. No matter, he just figures it's Neville Sinclair wants to grab something, that it was some kind of a heist of something that he really wanted, and it turned out to be a lot more complicated than what Eddie was expecting when Neville first came to him.
Right. And you're looking at this spot too. We've got to introduce before we get our first big look at Neville, or as we do. Eddie's got his henchman with him, and I love the names. One of them is Mike, and the other is Spanish Johnny.
Spanish Johnny, yeah.
what a great name for just a little mafia hood to have this little appellation.
And I just wondered if there's like non-Spanish Johnny somewhere in the
right. Yeah, it's there. Maybe there's Portuguese Johnny. I don't know.
Let me talk to Johnny. No, the other one. No.
Yeah, no, the other one. Darn it.
Do you remember where he came from? Yeah. But and Spanish Johnny has that beautiful pencil mustache. He looks like Cesar Romero on this thing.
Yeah, exactly. He does. And Mike's over there chewing gum like mad.
Yeah.
He sits there just chomping away, and that's his business. And you wonder, hey, I want to think it's Beeman's.
Oh,
we don't know.
It's a hope. And we have to, like, trying to set the state. There is no Neville Sinclair in real life, but he seems to be patterned after a fictionalized, sensationalized version of a very famous movie actor at the time, Errol Flynn. And Errol Flynn was known as he was a swashbuckling matinee idol. He's great. I mean, if you've ever seen Adventures of Robin Hood or Captain Blood and things like that, they'll make references to this. They'll just change the name slightly when they talk about his movies. He was this swashbuckling, suave, sophisticated, British-sounding guy with. He's actually Australian, but he just has this good clipped British accent, and you're like, wow, he just seems he should be entering every scene on a rope and
exactly.
with a sword in hand, and which fortunately he has here, and he's got those great big jodhpurs on. I mean, he's theatrical even at his house, and he obviously enjoys the look and feel of how he is in the movies, the character that he plays up on the screen. I just I love this version of him. One thing that I don't want to give away plot points, but Errol Flynn, long after he died in the 80s, a fella named Charles Hagum, who was kind of a sensationalist, I want to say a novelist, but he's kind of like a yellow journalistic writer, and he writes a lot about like film stars and stuff. He wrote a biography of Katharine Hepburn, for example, it was a big hit. But he's known also as a fabulist, that he made up a lot of stuff. And one of the things that he talked about with Errol Flynn is that he thought Errol Flynn was a fifth columnist. He was a Nazi, and he was working for the Nazis in Hollywood society and trying to recruit and evangelize the Nazi feelings in Hollywood, which utterly unproven. They try to make the idea that he, despite the fact that he kept saying that he was a German agent, there was never any proof. All it was Hingham's word, and there's really nothing. There's nothing documented about that. So,
right. Well, and it's amazing. After he died, there were so many, sort of scandals or accusations or things came to light, and you don't really know how much, if any, of it was true. There was I had read just recently that L. Ron Hubbard's son had said that Flynn was really close to his dad. He wasn't a part of Scientology, but that the two of them were up to all sorts of horrible things, smuggling drugs, all kinds of things like this. There's rape allegations, all kinds of things, and you just wonder how much of it could be true, and that who this Errol Flynn that we see on screen is a very flawed human being off screen, and how much of it is just, people who look for feet of clay in their heroes.
Yeah. But, what we have to do is separate that a lot of the stuff about Errol Flynn was fictional, and everything about
right.
Neville Sinclair is fictional, but it tells well.
Yes, it really, really does. And, so great to see Timothy Dalton in this role.
Isn't it? I mean, he was at the height of his Bond years. And License to Kill and Living Daylights are surrounding all of this, and
right,
he's just great to see. I mean, there's a couple of movies that I always associate him with. I associate him with The Living Daylights, and of course, he was Prince Baron in the 1979 or 1980 movie Flash Gordon.
Oh, that's right. I'd forgotten about that.
And he was this guy. he was kind of a Robin Hood character. He had the green felt, tights on, and he had that tree stump that you had to put your hand in to see if you were gonna get killed by poison, and he was starring. He was in the same scenes with Riff Raff from Rocky Horror in the Flash Gordon movie. It was just what a great scene.
And he also played Rhett Butler in kind of a this mini series that was sort of a follow on to Gone with the Wind. So it's funny, you've got him playing a fictionalized Errol Flynn, but then in this other thing he's recreating Clark Gable's role. And so there's clearly something about him that that we look at, the way he moves, the way he looks, that we think he probably could have been plugged in to the golden age of Hollywood right here in the 30s, like where the Rocketeer is taking place, and done just fine.
Oh yeah, and and the thing is that he's in a lot of movies where he's a good guy, but he just plays such a great bad guy.
Oh, he's fantastic as a villain, and I think there's something in that quality when he took on the role of James Bond. He's one of my favorite Bonds, absolutely. And this was one of the first times in the franchise history that they really tried a more serious sort of reset. Get back to the early Connery films, and more importantly, get back to Ian Fleming's books. Let's make it a little bit more grounded in reality. Let's make it a little bit more serious, a little bit darker.
Spycraft, yeah.
Exactly. And, you've got Sean Connery, who I've always described, he has this sort of a brutal savoir-faire about him, and he'll always be the best to me. So that's the end of that discussion. Thank you for having it. But when Dalton came along, and he really did bring something strong. I liked a lot of Roger Moore's movies earlier, the better generally. But Dalton came along and thought, this is a tough, strong guy. I believe him. This is a James Bond that could exist in this real world. Living Daylights in particular, License to Kill got a little bit more fantastic, but then again, he got darker and grittier in that film as well.
Yeah, and a lot of the criticisms of the Dalton Bond was that he wasn't as humorous. Every time he gave a joke, the jokes kind of fell flat, which was. It was definitely not Dalton, because Dalton knows how to do comedy. If you've seen Hot Fuzz, where he plays Simon Skinner in that movie, he's a villain, a perfect villain, but his nefarious schemes and stuff getting thwarted by Simon Pegg, especially in the climax of the movie, which is basically Godzilla set in Britain, and it's just so and he's really just great with physical comedy, and I love watching Dalton, is what I'm trying to say here in summary.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic introduction to the character just in this first minute.
Well, throughout this whole scene, and we see a little bit more movement and action from him over the next couple of minutes, but he's one of those guys that he's just he's absolutely comfortable in his own skin. As the wardrobe is great, that very, very swashbuckling, slightly baggy shirt and the high-waisted pants. Everything as he moves, it's elegant, it's economical, everything else. And you've got, Sorvino is immaculately dressed as well, but he's very snugly fit into this, into the perfect sort of mob boss uniform there of that suit. And it's funny to see the contrast between how they were costumed for this scene.
Yeah, he is definitely a 30s mob boss guy, right down to the bowler that he wears in scenes. The thing about Dalton Sinclair is that the way that Dalton presents every word that comes out of him is extremely theatrical. He chews on the last couple of. It's almost Shatner-esque the way he just drops those. The sentence where he just ends. He goes, it's what I pay you for. Now where's the package? The delivery is like, I don't think they had to do it. They didn't have to do a take two on that. He knew exactly how to handle it. No. And most of this is about Eddie finding out that it's more than just the package. All he knew was a package. It was a box that they had to deliver, but he didn't know what was in it. And Eddie delivers the ultimatum that unless you tell me what's going on, I'm going to the feds. And Sinclair finally relents and tells him it's a rocket. And And Eddie's like, of all the things that he thought that Sinclair, it's diamonds, it's a gold brick, it's it's somebody's, it's
Right.
the head of his, dreaded enemy or something, a rocket, and yeah, Sinclair at the very end of this minute says, yeah, like in the funny papers. Well, he doesn't say like in the funny papers, but that we'll find out.
He
Yeah,
has a line that we find, right at the
next
very
minute
beginning of the next minute.
Yeah,
these minutes broke perfectly right here. It's just, and he's got that smile he gets is really very disturbing, and we see that more than once from Neville Sinclair through the movie.
And it's like kind of highlighted by that pencil mustache too. It's like just the teeth and the
yes, exactly.
He's very cat-like.
Right, and he's smiling too big and sort of laughing too suddenly and too quickly for something so awkward. What I just as we're getting toward the end of the minute, when you've got Sorvino's line, as you said, a rocket, and he's surprised, and you can tell he's surprised, even though he's not overdoing it at all. Mike and Spanish Johnny, just the way they're moving behind him, sort of peeking over his shoulder, and they're kind of, they've been about to leave now. We're turning around. They've got this activity back there. It almost they're like mafia backup singers at this point. It's really funny through there.
Okay, we're old.
Okay, so again, for the younger set, you're googling Carmen Miranda and now Gladys Knight and the Pips, so you know who they are. But just that delivery, that line, just a rocket. It's enough to stop him and turn him around. He's not waving his arms. He's still perfectly economical and very very buttoned down, but that, as you said, that is absolutely not what he was expecting to hear.
And rockets at the time, although we've talked, we'll talk some more about the comic books tomorrow, but rockets in 1938 didn't match up. When we say rockets, we're thinking, Apollo, Saturn V. We know what a rocket looks like. We know what a rocket launch is like. We know what their purpose is in the world. As projectile missiles, they're very scary, but at the time, rockets were either something that you saw, as we'll find out tomorrow, in comic books, or they were silly little hobbies that people were playing with. Just set the stage a little bit here, especially in America. When you think about American rocketry, we are the only country in the world that has a national anthem that mentions rockets. So rockets from way back in 1812. Let's go with a brief history of the rocket. And
yes,
in the late 1700s, there was an Indian, an Asian Indian sultan known as Tipu Sultan, and he had come up with a method of building bamboo projectiles filled with gunpowder and mounted on stakes that could fly 2 miles and hit targets and explode with shrapnel that would kill, in this case, British soldiers in a radius of about 30 feet. They were massive terror weapons, really. The British encountered this in the 1790s in India and were promptly they did one thing. They picked up and got the hell home and tried to figure out what to do. A fellow named William Congreve, examined Tipu Sultan's rockets and figured out, instead of making them out of bamboo, if we made them out of metal and built a long stake at the bottom, improved the gunpowder that was used in it, a smokeless powder, a more powerful gunpowder, they could be effective projectiles. So the British did two things then. They improved on the Indian design of a rocket, and then they came up with another idea where they took ships, they took the masts off of them, they loaded them with these Congreve rockets and would tow them to coastal cities that they were at war with and shoot the rockets off in like a fusillade of maybe 3,000 or 4,000 rockets. And these ships that were mastless ships were called rocket ships. In the War of 1812, one of the sidelines of it was that the British took a couple of these rocket ships, towed them up and down the east coast of the United States, and launched missile attacks on Alexandria, Virginia. They launched them on Washington, D.C. This was in September of 1814. They finally decided to attack Baltimore, and they dragged one of their larger rocket ships, the Erebus, was brought up with over 3,000 Congreve rockets to attack a redoubt that was built on an island in the middle of Baltimore Harbor. They launched 3,000 rockets at this redoubt. The problem is that even though the rockets were a little bit longer, they had a little bit longer range than the guns at that fort. They would have a tendency to weathercock. They'd fly toward the wind rather than toward their target. So mostly the rocket attacks were ineffective. And thanks to Francis Scott Key, the idea that rockets were any kind of a menace, was dashed. And we still sing about that at the start of every ball game. But if you remember the song that by the dawn's early light, after the rocket's red glare, everything was still standing, even flags. So they were considered a very ineffective weapon, and that kind of idea lasted through the Civil War. It lasted through parts of World War I, and it also lasted in the ideas of Americans who had looked at rocket pioneers. Our most famous rocket pioneer being Robert Goddard. I'm sorry if I'm going long and off, but this is in my wheelhouse.
No, go right ahead. Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim O'Kane is actually a rocket scientist.
I got the paper on my wall and everything.
He can prove it.
So let's just go on a little bit about Robert Goddard. Robert Goddard, great American scientist, physicist, worked in Worcester, at Worcester, Massachusetts, at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, where he taught physics. He was also a great experimenter, and came up with the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. He figured out that if you take fuel and add a huge oxidizer to it, like, say, liquid oxygen, you could get a lot more bang for your buck with liquid fuel rather than just something like gunpowder. So he built a lot of rockets and tested them. The New York Times had interviewed Robert Goddard about what are the possibilities for rockets. He said, well, if you take a rocket and given enough fuel, you could probably hit the moon. You could, go send it up to the moon. And the New York Times, after having that interview, they wrote a very scathing editorial, which is kind of pointed out as a bad idea to attack somebody in the science community. The New York Times had posted saying that Robert Goddard lacks the common sense that's ladled out every day in high school, because how can you use a rocket in a vacuum when there's nothing to push against?
Nothing to push against.
So,
yes.
The New York Times did retract that editorial on July 16th, 1969, the day that Neil Armstrong and Buzz and Mike Collins went to the moon. So thank
goodness that they eventually corrected themselves. Let me hop back just super quick little tangent. You're talking about Fort McHenry and the Star Spangled Banner and everything else. One of the things that absolutely blew my mind on my first trip to DC about 15 years ago was that the flag that Scott Key wrote the poem about, the Star Spangled Banner, actually survives. Yes. It's huge, and it's undergone a tremendous conservation and mild sort of restoration process. And so my first visit there, you could sit there and watch, people on scaffolding with this thing laid out on a big flat surface with their white gloves and hairnets and things, working on it sort of thread by thread. But that was just incredible. You grow up knowing that song. You don't really think about a single individual flag that inspired it and that it actually survives. And they also you can actually touch some of the quote unquote bombs that burst in air. So, be sure to check out the Smithsonian next time you're in DC. Yeah. And I guess that's their free advertising.
Yeah, if you go to the Air and Space Museum's annex out by Dulles Airport, the Udvar Hazy, am I saying that right? Yes.
Yes. Absolutely.
And Udvar Hazy has a great collection of Congreve's early rockets and later rockets. You can see the improvements as weapons of death.
It's also interesting quickly that we started this minute talking about Lindbergh, and Lindbergh and Goddard became very, very close.
Yeah,
as you know, probably far better than I do. But they were sort of close for life, and in speaking of people who may or may not have had some sympathies with the Germans at this point in history, at the time this movie is taking place, this is October 15, 1938?
Yes. The night of the 14th into the 15th, yes.
Okay, 14th into the 15th. So while this movie is taking place, Charles and Anne-Mara Lindbergh are in Germany, and about 3 or 4 days from now, Lindbergh is going to be sort of awkwardly given an award by Hermann Goering of the Luftwaffe, and he accepts it, but he's not really thrilled with it, and that really was one of the things that started sort of tainting his reputation, complicating his reputation at home. As in this stage, we don't really, there's a lot of mixed feelings about the clouds of war looming on the horizon and all that. Lindbergh being a very, very prominent America first, let's not get involved in foreign wars. And so interesting that we start with his statue. Now we're talking about Goddard. Goddard and Lindbergh are close. And again, right now in the context of what's happening in the movie, Lindbergh is over in Germany.
Yeah, we'll be in upcoming minutes. We'll be talking about more of the political situation and the popular situation that was going on with America's attitude toward the war in Europe and everything going on over there in 1938. Where we'll get into that very shortly. But and Goddard, after that 1920 article, disparaging article in the New York Times, Goddard decided, the hell with making any kind of public claims about this stuff. He was going to go with doing some more research, and fortunately, finding a friend in Lindbergh, and I think Guggenheim was the other fellow he was the money man that had helped fund. Well, Lindbergh had put him together with a couple of people with money to continue to fund his research in both rocket propulsion and more importantly navigation, and the idea of having a gyroscopic control of where the rocket was going besides just where the wind was going to blow it was a really important part. American rocket technology and the American government, after that experience of the War of 1812, had been tainted by rocket technology. They didn't think of it as anything important. So it was kind of pushed to the back corners, just as we had discussed earlier that Billy Mitchell had been ignored for a strategic bombing. Goddard's people ignoring Goddard in the government would pay for it later, because even though America wasn't interested in these things, there was an amateur rocket group in Germany who was fascinated by all of these developments of Goddard, who unfortunately for him, but fortunately for these folks in Germany, published extremely detailed engineering drawings in his patent applications of how to build a turbine pump and how to build a supercharger so you could feed fuel through. You fed fuel through the outside of the engine bell of his rockets. One of the fellows that read a lot of Goddard's stuff and also included a lot of correspondence back and forth to Goddard was a young man named Werner von Braun. Von Braun is trying to find funding for his amateur rocketry experiments, and unfortunately found a great deal of funding through the National Socialist Party in Germany. Von Braun is a very ambivalent moral character. The more you read about him, great scientist, and just there's some questionable activities that he was involved with. But he understood the kind of work that Goddard was doing, and managed to parlay Goddard's research into active work on building much larger rockets than the models that Goddard was constructing. And we'll talk about that later on in newsreels to come. But
yes, one other last little thing about von Braun. I grew up knowing his name from reruns of the great Disney stuff.
Yeah.
Was it Man in Space? Was it Man in Space or Men into Space? There were two different series. I think it was Man in Space. Yeah. And it would be part of the Wonderful World of Disney. We'd see those in reruns in the early 70s. Of course, these were all from the 50s. But you'd see von Braun coming out and talking, and then showing all that great, like Chesley Bonestell artwork, all that amazing stuff.
In that case, it was Ward Kimball, who was one of the
one of the animators,
and he did. It's fantastic work. It's available out there. I mean, they show it on the Vault Disney show on the Disney Channel, but you can also get the entire collection. There's the Man in Space, and then there's ones about the moon and also about the exploration of Mars. But it's just fascinating to see that between that and the series that Von Braun had worked on with Collier's magazine, that really pushed the and that was the Chesley Bonestell.
That's right. That's really where that artwork came into play, wasn't it? Was the Collier stuff. But anyway, it's funny here that there's this loose sort of series of connections that brings us back to Disney, and here we are at least occasionally talking about a Disney film when we don't wander off in our own world.
It really is stunning how many different confluences happen in this one. I mean, we've talked about Hollywood, we've talked about spacecraft, we've talked about weaponry, and pretty much the history of the United States, all in this, and Errol Flynn too.
And architecture and opera. So I mean, this is no vacuum cleaner minute, which I think everybody can agree is a classic.
That's true.
That was a classic episode.
It was thrilling. But we cover a lot of ground just in this 1 minute, which is a great reason of why we do these as a minute by minute basis. It's funny, a lot of people, when you first explain to them they've never heard of the movies by minutes concept, you're like, why would you watch a movie like that so slowly? But it's because there's so many things to talk about in each minute, and here we are just on an average Monday talking about one average minute of this show. Well, we've got a lot of minutes to cover in the future, so let me let everybody get off their treadmills or wherever you're listening to this, in your car or jogging down your street, and you can pick us up here tomorrow and Tuesday, and we'll talk a little bit more about where rockets were familiar to the public eye, but we'll talk about that tomorrow. If you would like to talk with us on social media, we are always available in so many different forms. Of course, at Twitter, we are available at Rocketeer Minute, and on Facebook, look for the Rocketeer Minutes Bulldog Cafe. The Rocketeers Bulldog Cafe. That's out there. Everybody gets together and chats, and we post a lot of other things like pictures of production shots, other pictures of old aircraft at the time. I am sure that while we're talking about this, we're going to see a lot of pictures of Frank Lloyd Wright architecture and Robert Goddard images. So check out the Rocketeers Bulldog Cafe on Facebook, and last but not least, the great big website rocketeerminute.com, where you can get all your back episodes, and there's some cool swag about all things Rocketeer that's available through Amazon. It's right on our shopping subsection of rocketeerminute.com, but check that out. If you haven't already, we're 3 weeks in, or two weeks in. No, this is the third week. This is the beginning of the third week. Please go to either iTunes or Google Play, search for Rocketeer Minute, click subscribe, and you will have this show delivered hot and fresh every morning, actually the night before, right to your mobile device.
And if I may interject, by all means, please leave us a review. If you're enjoying it, if you've got feedback any kind, we'd love to see reviews on iTunes. We love to see the comments on the social stuff. Let us know how we're doing, so that we're not just shouting into the void.
That would help a lot. A lot of people ask, and we really do need to give a good shout out to the amazing Tom Geyer, who he's doing our end theme that you're hearing playing under us right now. So why don't you join us here next time, tomorrow, Tuesday, on the Rocketeer Minute. So until then, over and out.
Go get him, kid.